come now to the Monday evening study at 8 o'clock, and this is number 15 now in our series of considerations this week of the books of Jeremiah, the life of Job, John the Baptist, Solomon, Lazarus. Now back in the book of Jeremiah once again. Let's take chapter 1. We spent a little time this afternoon looking at the call of Jeremiah and recognizing how the call of this man was in perfect harmony with the principles of Sabbath rest, which placed God at the head of the church through Jesus Christ, and each one of us as brethren or members of the body of Jesus Christ. We'll now pass on to notice the messages that God called upon Jeremiah to proclaim to an apostate and unrepentant Israel. We'll start now with verse 11. Chapter 1, Jeremiah, chapter 1, verse 11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Jeremiah, what seest thou? And I said, I see a rod of an almond tree. Then said the Lord unto me, Thou hast well seen, for I will hasten my word to perform it. And the word of the Lord came unto me the second time, saying, What seest thou? And I said, I see a seething pot, and the face thereof is toward the north. Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For behold, for lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah. And I will utter my judgments against them, touching all their wickedness, who have forsaken me, and have burned incense unto other gods, and worshipped the works of their own hands. Thou therefore gird up thy loins, and arise, and speak unto them all I command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. For behold, I have made thee this day a defence city, and an iron pillar, and brazen walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against the princes thereof, against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. And they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee. Now this chapter, or the last part of this chapter, lays down an extremely interesting setting for the condition of the situation which existed at that point of time. Last year, in our study of the book of Daniel, we recognized the same point, that there were three great powers involved in the battles which rose at this point of time, when the Babylonians, here called the kingdoms of the north, came down to fight against the land of Israel and to destroy it. So we'll put down first of all the great and mighty power of Babylon. And that was the king of the north. Now secondly, we have a nation which call themselves Israel. In the spiritual sense they call themselves that. Literally, of course, it was Judah and Benjamin. And they were the Jews, but I shall put down here the words apostate Israel. I don't mean by the 10 tribes either, I mean the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Now last of all, we have a third class of people which God referred to in verses 11 to 13 of this chapter. And when God predicted that the mighty power of Babylon would come and overcome apostate Israel, he made it very clear to Jeremiah that they would not be able to overcome him, and obviously, of course, those who stood with him. Now at this point of time there was a very great difference, of course, between the position occupied by Jeremiah and such men as Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach and Abednego, and their parents and other godly families in Israel, or in Judah and in Benjamin. scattered, of course, throughout the length and breadth of those two territories, the territory of Judah and the territory of Benjamin. Now, what shall we call that third group of people of whom Jeremiah was the representative? What shall we call them? True Israel. Right? True Israel. Now, I'm going to spend just a few moments reviewing some of the information we have learned in the past. I think the refresher on this will do us all good. And those, of course, who are new amongst us need to understand our position in regard to these principles. There are two ways of identifying the various powers referred to in Bible prophecy. One way we call the geographical method of interpretation. The other we call the gospel method of interpretation, or the true method of interpretation. Now, the common way employed by most people, of course, is to take a statement like the king of the north and properly look northward from a certain point of reference. Now, what is the point of reference, obviously, in this chapter of Jeremiah, in which reference is made to the king of the north? Now, what is the point of reference? Jerusalem, or Israel. Now, the simple fact is, however, that geographically Babylon was not to the north of Israel. It wasn't. If you turn to the back of your Bibles and pick up a typical map, and we'll possibly make a quick sketch on the board to make this point quite clear, you'll find that Babylon lay far off in an easterly direction from the city of Jerusalem. East and slightly north, but not too much north. Take a look at the maps that I've got here. You'll find that that is true, that Babylon lay almost due east from Jerusalem, but just slightly northward by about perhaps 15 degrees is all. Maybe 10 degrees to the north, bearing probably perhaps 070 from Jerusalem and take you out to Babylon. And 090, of course, is due east. However, of course, in their attacks upon the land of Israel, they always appeared in the north, because the Babylonians marched up the Euphrates River, arrived at a position to the north of Israel, and then they came down from that northerly direction to make their final onslaught against the land of Canaan. So I suppose, so far as the Jews themselves were concerned, when they first of all saw the Babylonians coming, when they first got word of their coming, in what position were they then placed? In the north. However, it's important that we recognize that Babylon is not called the king of the north because she lay, or because her approach is from the actual north. Babylon is called the king of the north because of what she is. Now, first of all, I'd like to take a look at one or two references in the book of Jeremiah. Actually, I'll pass over 46 chapters to chapter 46, 45 chapters to chapter 46, where we have a very clear and explicit identification of Nebuchadnezzar as being the king of the north. Now, this is quite important to us because in the last verses of Daniel chapter 11, we find reference being made to the king of the north and the king of the south and the pleasant land. And I suppose I should have added one more power here, and that was Egypt. I'd forgotten about this, but Egypt does figure quite largely and strongly in the struggles between Babylon and Israel and so forth. So here we have finally Egypt as the fourth of these powers, and Egypt was called the king of what? Right, the king of the south. So there are the four forces involved in the history of Jeremiah and Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now then, let's come to chapter 46. Jeremiah, and read verse 1. The word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Gentiles, against Egypt, against the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates in Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, smote in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Order you the buckler and shield and draw near to battle. Now it goes on talking about the the routing of the Egyptians at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 13, we find that this is continued as follows. The word that the Lord spake to Jeremiah the prophet, how Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, should come and smite the land of Egypt. Now, in other words, what now follows is a description, or a prophecy rather, of Nebuchadnezzar's onslaught against the Egyptians. Pass on now to verse 20, which says, Egypt is like a very fair heifer, but destruction cometh, it cometh out of the north. Also her hired men are in the midst of her like fatted bullocks, for they also turned back and are fled away together. They did not stand, because the day of their calamity was come upon them, and the time of their visitation. The voice thereof shall go like a serpent, for they shall march with an army, and come against her with axes as hewers of wood. They shall cut down her forest, saith the Lord, though it cannot be searched, because they are more than the grasshoppers, and are innumerable. The daughter of Egypt shall be confounded, and shall be delivered into the hand of the people of the north. The Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saith, Behold, I will punish the multitude of No, and Pharaoh, and Egypt, with their gods and their kings, even Pharaoh and all them that trust in him. And I will deliver them into the hands of those who seek their lives, and into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of his servants, and afterward it shall be inhabited as in the days of old, saith the Lord. Now these statements, of course, with many others throughout the book of Jeremiah, confirm that with unfailing consistency Babylon is referred to as the king of the north. Babylon is the king of the north. Egypt is the king of the south. And Palestine is the pleasant land, or Zion. That we should just put it after true Israel, because this is the real Zion, true Israel. Now, let's examine for a few moments this very important principle of interpretation, correct Bible interpretation, which is based upon the fact that the books of Daniel and the Revelation, and therefore the book of Jeremiah, and in fact every book in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is a revelation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the one great principle pervades all these mighty revelations given by God to his faithful servants. Now, for instance, in the book Counsels to Writers and Editors, I'll give you the exact page, although I don't have the book here at the moment, I don't think. Sister Wright tells us that we are page 175 in the book Counsels to Writers and Editors. Sister Wright tells us that we are to study the gospel, that gospel which is given to John on the Isle of Patmos, the gospel of Jesus Christ. In other words, the book of Revelation is the gospel of Christ. Now, Revelation being the unfolding of Daniel, what then must Daniel be? Likewise, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And inasmuch as Daniel was trained by Jeremiah, and therefore his work's a reflection of that training, what must the book of Jeremiah be? Very good. It's likewise the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the gospel principle is this. It is not where you are that makes you what you are, but rather it's the character which you have, irrespective of your geographical location, which makes you to be the person that you are. Now, let's test this in regard to Bible prophecy. Now, we know, for instance, first of all, just do a rough map here of Palestine, and here's the Euphrates River going down to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and here was the great city of Babylon built upon the Euphrates River. Now, when God looked down upon that city, he did not basically see a great political power, although most religious commentators look at Babylon in that kind of light. What God saw was a great apostate system of religion. That to God was Babylon. And as we've learned, of course, that which makes Babylon is the principle of man ruling over men in the place of God in the church. Now that system of religion, of course, depended upon the support given to it by a great army, a great nation, a great king. But when the time came that Babylon fell as a city, and Babylon ceased to be a political power, ceased to be a military power, did the real Babylon cease to exist? By no means. The priests of Mithra fled from Babylon over to two places. One place was Asia Minor, and the other place was over here in Italy, or the city of Rome, where they re-established. In Asia Minor it was at Pergamos, there's Greece up there. Right now here in Asia Minor was the city of Pergamos, that the priests from Babylon re-established the Babylonian religion there, and also over here in the city of Rome. Now, the geographical location had changed. Babylon no longer was built upon the great Euphrates River, was no longer supported by the political power called Babylon. They have now moved to a new location, but had the change of location in any way at all changed the nature and character of that religion? In no sense of the word whatsoever. In other words, Babylon in Pergamos was the same Babylon she'd been back here on the Euphrates River. Now, in Revelation chapter 17, for instance, in Revelation chapter 18, Revelation chapter 19, and also other parts of the book of Revelation, we read about Babylon the Great being very much a present power down in the last days of human history. Now then, what is the geographical location of this last day Babylon? Is it confined to one particular part of the earth? It's universal. Covers the entire world. At the present moment, of course, we have the atheistic powers of communism and heathenism. We know perfectly well the time is shortly coming where they shall be converted to the Roman Catholic theology, and when they are, then the entire world will be covered universally with that mighty power Babylon. Now, how shall we, or how do we in these last days identify this last day Babylon? By where she is located? Do we find ourselves looking for a power back there on the old Euphrates River? Or do we look for a character? We look for a character. Now, obviously, of course, if we were to go looking for Babylon in the old geographical location, what would we find? Just ruins and wild animals and doleful creatures. We find the place where not even the arrow will pinch his tent by night, and no one will ever sleep there at night, as the prophecy says, and has never been broken. So therefore, in this particular case, we're almost forced to use the spiritual method of interpretation, which says that we are what we are, not because of where we are, but because of our character or our spiritual condition. Now, I can't overemphasize the importance of consistently applying that principle throughout the Word of God. It's very distressing, of course, to find certain commentators who mix the two principles. For instance, Uriah Smith, in his very famous book entitled Daniel and the Revelation, I see if there's a copy here in this library, now as I think about it, has used one system in one place and a different system altogether in another place. The book doesn't seem to be here, but you do find Uriah Smith saying in his comments on Daniel chapter 11 and verse 14 that unless the modern king of the north is identified by the power which occupies the same territory as the ancient king of the north, we are left with no principle to guide us in interpretation. And so he's saying that the geographical location of the modern king of the north, which must coincide with the ancient king of the north, which of course in Daniel chapter 11 was located here at Pergamos in Asia Minor, is the only way of determining who the modern king of the north is. So Uriah Smith there uses geographical interpretation, but when you come to Revelation chapter 19 and Revelation chapter 17, then he uses the spiritual method to identify modern Babylon. Now, once you start mixing your principles of interpretation just to suit the bent of your mind then what you end up with, very obviously, confusion. There is a consistent thread which runs all the way through the Word of God, and that consistent thread never changes. So therefore, the identification of these powers must be done on the basis of their character, not on the basis of their geographical location. Now, to really confirm this, we have the method confirmed by Sister Wright, because in the book Great Controversy there are comments on Revelation chapter 11. And Revelation chapter 11, of course, deals with the rise of the beast and the bottomless pits, which spiritually is called Egypt and Sodom, as you read in chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. Now, when Sister Wright, in Great Controversy, page 269, identifies the power which is called Egypt and Sodom, she does not look either to the geographical location of Egypt or of Sodom. Now, once again, of course, where is Sodom today? Is it a great flourishing city? It's buried beneath the waters of the Dead Sea somewhere. They can't even find the place, let alone for it to be an inhabited and prosperous city. So therefore, if once again we're looking to a geographical location to find a people symbolized by Sodom today, we best get diving suits and start searching the bottom of the Dead Sea. And you certainly won't find a powerful, flourishing nation there. So once again, we're obliged to go looking for the spiritual counterpart rather than the material or physical counterpart of the power symbolized in this case. Now, when Sister Wright identifies Egypt, where Egypt was in 1798, on page 269 of Great Controversy, she says, the great city in whose streets the witnesses are slain, and where their dead bodies lie, is spiritually Egypt. Of all nations presented in Bible history, Egypt most boldly denied the existence of the living God and resisted his commands. No monarch ever ventured upon more open and high-handed rebellion against the authority of heaven than did the king of Egypt. When the message was brought in by Moses in the name of the Lord, Pharaoh proudly answered, "Who is Jehovah, that I should hearken unto his voice to let Israel go? I know not Jehovah, and moreover I will not let Israel go." This is atheism. And the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God, and would manifest a like spirit of unbelief and defiance. A little further down, Sister Wright says, this prophecy has received a most exact and striking fulfillment in the history of France. Now we find, therefore, that Sister Wright did not support the geographical method of interpretation. Otherwise, she would have said, okay, in 1798, Egypt was down here. But no, she looked for Egypt and found it way over here in France, because there she found the atheism which had been given birth in the land of Egypt and which had now spread to this other distant country. Now today, is the king of the south to be found in this world? Is it confined to France or Egypt? No, it's not. It is also a universal power. It does, of course, find its chief location today in such countries as Russia, or the hidden lands of Africa, communist China and those places. And you'll find, of course, that there is a steady confrontation between the king of the south, which of course is atheism in those great lands, and the king of the north, which is apostate Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. In the nations of the world where those religious powers are dominant, such as America, Europe, Australia and South Africa, usually form a power bloc which in turn have confrontations with the other power bloc, namely the king of the south. Now, I don't plan, of course, at this moment to take up the last verses of Daniel chapter 11, because we've been to those before, but we must understand that the principle of correct prophetic interpretation is not to start looking at geographical locations, but to start looking at the character of the power which once occupied a certain geographical location. That power, very likely, and in fact mostly, has moved from that geographical location and is now in some far distant place, but the character hasn't changed, and therefore that power is still the same. Tonight we sit here in this room in Clarksville. This time next week we'll be scattered to the north, the south, the east and the west. Within 2 or 3 weeks I'll be back far across the seas in Australia again. Now while you sit in this room today, you are a certain kind of person. You have a certain character. When you climb into your car and drive 1,000 miles from here, or take a jet aircraft and fly 10,000 miles from here, and find yourself in an altogether new geographical location, have you become a different person there from what you were here? Not at all. You are still the same person. Geography doesn't change your character. It is true, of course, that races that belong to certain geographical areas tend to develop a certain national characteristic. That's true. But when you, as a child of God, move from here to there, that doesn't make you to be a heathen or an unrighteous person. So geography counts for nothing in the interpretation of Bible prophecy. The king of the north is not such because he comes from the north. The king of the north is such because he is the counterfeit of the great original king of the north, which was Jesus Christ himself, as Isaiah chapter 14, or is it chapter 12, most plainly and positively declares. Let me just check that. Chapter 14, verses 12 over to verse 15, where the devil said he would ascend into the sides of the north in chapter 14, verse 13 of the book of Isaiah. And it is because of who he is, not because of where he is, that the king of the north is the king of the north. Now, having very briefly established this point, and if anybody is left at this moment without really understanding that point, then put it in the question box and we'll answer it on the question afternoon in a couple of days' time. Now, let's come back to Jeremiah, the first chapter, and we want to spend a few moments now developing the significance of these divisions that we have on the board. Let's no longer think of Babylon as a political power. Let's forget politics. After all said and done, what is the counsel in the spirit of prophecy about politics? Stay away from them. We're not to participate in politics. And the Bible is not a book of politics. It is not the recital of political powers versus political powers. The Bible is the history of the great controversy. And in that battle, the battle of the great controversy, what powers are in conflict with each other, political or spiritual? Spiritual powers. And therefore, when a political power becomes involved, such as ancient Babylon, ancient Egypt, and ancient Israel, then we have to look beyond the political forces, because they are only the mechanism or the instrument which gives support to the real power involved, and that's the great spiritual forces that were in that particular land. So then, let's think of Babylon as a great spiritual system, a religion. And what was apostate Israel? Likewise. And what is true Israel? Likewise a spiritual system. And what was Egypt? Likewise a spiritual system. Now, between the Israelites, or the Jews, the apostate Jews, and the Babylonians, on the surface there is no harmony, there is no unity, there is only hostility. They are great contenders for world dominion, and they are opposed to each other in the worst kind of way. Now, the candid observer looking on might say to himself, well, this has to be two different systems altogether. So let's examine that proposition in the light of what took place back in those days. Now, first of all, let's look at the reputation of these two nations, Babylon versus Israel. Had Babylon ever had a beginning as God's true people? As that particular nation? No. Now, true enough, of course, if you go back far enough, go way back to the days when the Tower of Babel was built, and beyond that to Noah's time, beyond that to Adam's time, we have to recognize, of course, that all people find their origins in the true church of God. All people. But I'm thinking of the immediate rise of that particular nation, and they rose out of a people who were already an apostate people, and therefore they had no tradition wherein God had personally called them and wherein they had done marvelous things under God's might and power. On the other hand, what about apostate Israel? Did they have a great religious tradition? They most certainly did. They had the story of their deliverance from the land of Egypt, their crossing of the Red Sea, their conquest of the land of Canaan, their overthrowing of great cities like Jericho, the overcoming of the combined kings which came against them, the exploits of that wonderful warrior David, who became the second king of Israel, the combined nation, the glory of Solomon's temple, or Jehovah's temple built in Solomon's day. Now, as you remember, of course, that when the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, she was absolutely amazed at the wisdom and the glory and the beauty and the power possessed by the people of Israel. So Israel had a tremendous background. Now, they had lost, of course, that glory. They had changed from a people who had worshipped Jehovah and followed his ways and practiced his laws to a people who had adopted the same system of government and the same system of religion as the Babylonians themselves. So religiously they were Babylonians. Spiritually speaking, they were called Israel. But what were they in fact? They were Babylonians. Now then, let's just rehearse the evidences by which we can say with positive assurance that apostate Israel had literally become a Babylonian power. First of all, what was the god that was worshipped during the days of the last kings of Judah and Benjamin? What god was worshipped? Baal, right? And who was Baal? Was he not the god of the Babylonians? Right? What does the word Baal actually mean? It means Lord. It's the Babylonian word which means Lord. Now, there was a time when I was much younger than I am now when I thought that the Roman Catholic religion, which is modern Babylon, was such a crude and obvious system that anybody who had the first idea of the Word of God would not be fooled by that organization's religion. But as the years have gone by, I've had occasion to come in contact with Roman Catholic people. I've had occasion to read their catechisms. I've had occasion to recognize the warnings given in the Spirit of Prophecy where the counterfeit will so closely resemble the true that it will be impossible to distinguish between them excepting by the Holy Scriptures. And I have been absolutely amazed to see how closely the counterfeit does in fact resemble the true. It's quite incredible, it's quite frightening. And when today I see Seventh-day Adventists actually leaving the Seventh-day Adventist Church and actually becoming Roman Catholics, I am not surprised, because the transition is not so great. And not for one moment am I, of course, suggesting the Roman Catholic religion is the truth of God. That's the religion of Antichrist. We know that for certain. But make no mistake about it, it's a very subtle and clever counterfeit of the real thing. And only those in the last days who are absolutely established upon the Word of God will be able to withstand the enormous pressures of that counterfeit. I turn to page 593 in the book Great Controversy, page 593, page 594, where we are warned about the closeness of this counterfeit. It says, this is page 593, Great Controversy, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. Isaiah 8 verse 20. The people of God are directed to the Scriptures as their safeguard against the influence of false teachers and the delusive power of spirits of darkness. Satan employs every possible device to prevent men from obtaining a knowledge of the Bible, for its plain utterances reveal his deceptions. At every revival of God's work, the prince of evil is aroused to more intense activity. He is now putting forth his utmost efforts for a final struggle against Christ and his followers. the last great delusion is soon to open before us. Antichrist. Now, who is at the present time and who will be down to the end of time Satan's master system of Antichrist, more than any other? The Roman Catholic religion. So I read now, and as I read these words, think in terms of that mighty force or power. Antichrist is to perform his marvellous works in our sight. So closely will the counterfeit resemble the true that it will be impossible to distinguish between them except by the Holy Scriptures. By their testimony, every statement and every miracle must be tested. A little further down, none but those who have fortified the mind with the truths of the Bible will stand through the last great conflict. To every soul will come the searching test, shall I obey God rather than men? The decisive hour is even now at hand. Are our feet planted on the rock of God's immutable word? Are we prepared to stand firm in defense of the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus? Now, when the statement says, are we prepared to stand firm in defense of the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, the question is not asking you, have you made a firm decision to do that? It is asking you rather, have you by thorough and prolonged study, by passing through tests and trials, by sinking into the Word of God, obtained an inbuilt preparation or moulding which will give you the strength to stand in the hour of test and trial? It's much more than making a decision to do that. It's actually passing through a period of preparation, so built into us comes the strength to withstand that mighty power. So first of all then, as we noted a moment ago, the Israelites were actually worshipping Baal. Now from time to time, as you read in the story in the book of Chronicles, Kings and Chronicles, there arose men like King Hezekiah and King Josiah and King Asa, King Jehoshaphat. And when those men arose to power, what did they find standing up and down the length and breadth of the land? Idols. Idols to Ashtaroth. Idols to Baal. And what do those good kings do sometimes? They smash those idols, and they thus, along with the institution of a great revival in the land of Israel. So the Israelites were actually worshipping the same gods as were the Babylonians, right? The same visible images as were the Babylonians. Now let's take the matter deeper than that. When we go back to the days of Samuel, the people of God then said to Samuel, make us a king like the kings around about us. Now up until that point of time, God had ruled the land of Israel his way. And that way, of course, was a reproduction of the heavenly system, where up in heaven there was God, who through the one man, Jesus Christ, communicated everything to and governed the angels through Jesus Christ. And you might say a one-man movement. And then upon this earth, God continued that, because then upon this earth was one visible person through whom God spoke to all the people, and that person was Moses, later Joshua, then Samuel, and so forth. So now we come down to the people being the ones who were finally administered to by this system of government. Now, the people came to the place where they rejected that system and said, make us a king like the kings around about us. Instead of looking to God, they would now look to a king. And a king now took charge of them, and God very carefully explained in 1 Samuel chapter 8 just what the situation would be when they got their wish and had the king that they desired to have. And that king would take them and rule over them at his pleasure and at his will, and literally that king would take the place of God over the people of that time. Now, when the people of Israel made that decision, and in spite of God's pleading with them and warning them what the outcome would be, they said, no, we want that king and we're going to have that king, give it to us. Then what only could God do? Give that king. And when they took that step, they took a mighty step in what direction? Babylon's direction. They didn't come out, they went into Babylon. And while they did not in one step go all the way into Babylon, they certainly went a long way in that direction. Now we saw in Solomon's day, of course, that Solomon lost sight of his source. He began to trust in himself. He began to do God's work in his own way. And every one of those things is the introduction of Babylonian principles into the church of God. So when you lose sight of the source, then obviously you make man to be the source in the place of God, and what are you doing? You are building Babylon. You are building the papacy. And so, while over on the river Euphrates a mighty Babylonian power is being built up, over in the land of Israel another Babylonian power is being built up. And these two powers were identical in character, even though they were called by different names, and even though they both made different professions. King Nebuchadnezzar, of course, made no profession to serve the living God. He served the gods of Babylon. But the Jews professed to serve the living God. Now, the Babylonians, of course, entertained the idea that this was the true church of God, whereas, in fact, of course, the true church of God was made of men like Jeremiah, Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And that's why, of course, it's so critically important for us to be able to identify a power not by where it is, but by what it is. In other words, if we were to look at apostate Israel and say, okay, that power lives in the territory God gave to his church, therefore because they live in that place, they must be the church of God, would we not be totally deceived and mistaken if we drew those conclusions and worked on that kind of logic? Why, certainly we would. But if we examine the character of ancient Israel, apostate Israel in Jeremiah's day, and compare their religious practices, their idol worshipping, their system of government in which there is a king like the kings around about them, and men ruling over men where there is oppression and extortion and so forth, we find no difference in actual religious practice between apostate Israel and the Babylonians, excepting for certain window dressing. The window dressing, of course, was the sanctuary service, the rituals and ceremonies which they practiced, in contradistinction, of course, to the rituals that were practiced in the land of Babylon. But that was only window dressing. Underneath that facade, that outer garment, there was no difference in character whatsoever. And so literally, when Babylon marched against Israel, it was a case of Babylon fighting whom? Babylon. And because Babylon on the Euphrates was young and vigorous and strong, while Babylon in the land of Israel was decadent and dying away, then the stronger Babylon certainly had the power to overcome the weaker Babylon. Now, one would expect, of course, that Babylon would recognize Babylon and unite with Babylon, and they'd work together, of course, to conquer the entire world, but that's not the way of Babylon. One section of Babylon is determined to develop world supremacy for itself. This frustrates Satan's purposes, of course, and so they come against each other and destroy each other. In this case, of course, Babylon destroyed the land of Israel after they'd gone down and wiped out the Egyptians, and that left the true church of God, a tiny little remnant of people of whom Jeremiah was the chief exponent at this point of time. Now, as we close the study period, let's emphasize the point then that the identification of a church, an organization, a movement, is not by their traditions, not by their profession, not by where they are, but only by what they are. That's the only identification that determines what a people or a nation is. We'll explore this further in the morning as our time is now gone. Let's turn to our closing hymn, which is number 5.